One of the things that I try to teach my, seminary students is that Baptists are historically, in many varieties, very concerned with democracy as a theological project.
You're listening to Good Faith Weekly. I'm Mitch Randall.
And I'm Missy Randall.
We're here each week exploring the intersection of faith and culture.
We find people who stand up, speak out, and step forward
for inclusion, freedom, and justice for all.
It's time for Good Faith Weekly.
Brought to you by Good Faith Media. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, Missy and I are going to catch up what might be the final time if Monday just goes off the rails. But later on in this pod, Missy and I sat down with Professor Leah Payne. Professor Payne has a new book out titled God Gave Rock and Roll to You, A History of Contemporary Christian Music. It was a stroll down memory lane for Missy and myself. It's a great conversation about the contemporary Christian music industry. It is a great pod. Stay tuned. You're not going to want to miss it. Hello there, Missy.
Hey, how are you?
I am good. How are you?
Terrible.
And ladies and gentlemen, Eeyore has arrived on the show today. Why are you terrible? It's because I'm out of...
I feel like we need to acknowledge this. The sound may be a little bit different.
Yeah.
Because once again, we are several states between us.
Right.
And our regular listeners will remember that last week, I think for the last 3 weeks, we've been in different states, in part because you have this horrid cough that will not go away.
I do.
So last week I was in Colorado with family. This week I come back home and you are in Arkansas.
Right.
As of this recording, correct? Right.
Correct.
So I'm going a peaceful night's sleep, but we have a problem.
What's the problem?
Tomorrow is trash day.
Yes, it is trash day. And I left them out right by the sidewalk. So all you have to do is roll them to the street.
Actually, they're not by the sidewalk. They're up by the house on the driveway. Yes. But somehow they have to get to this sidewalk. And yes. So I'm all about female empowerment.
Yes.
Until
I'm
trash
all about
day.
equality too. I mean, I want to empower you and make you feel an equal part.
Until trash day. And then I am the best fundamentalist there ever was.
Oh, and there's Missy's fundamentalist coming out.
So I'm gonna need you to come back home and take the trash out before tomorrow morning. So BT dubs. I've been trying to plot out how I'm going to get the trash out after dark. We're recording at night and it's very dark outside. It's very cold and trash is kind of icky. So yeah. So right now it's not good. I'm going to fixate on the tiny, insignificant problems because I don't want to look at what's going to happen 3 days from now when our world is going to fundamentally change.
Yeah, I was going to say, well, I think probably the trash is the least of your problems these days, even though, if I need to make a phone call and have somebody come over and take the trash out, I can.
I'm great about fixating on the little unimportant things when there's big things looming. So that's where
Absolutely. Well, two big things looming right now, Missy, is that this is the last pod before January 20th, 2025, and President-elect Donald Trump takes the oath of office and becomes President Donald Trump. So lots of unknowns, Missy.
None of us asked for.
It really is. So many sequels we didn't really ask for.
But not if you did, you're probably not listening to this pod.
So yes, he is taking office. I'm sure it's going to be the largest crowd, since Woodstock, and so it's going to be an interesting next week as it unfolds.
This week we have a conversation that is very relatable to where we are today. That is with Leah Payne, who wrote a book called God Gave Rock and Roll to You, A History of Contemporary Christian Music. And we talked to her about how that plays into our current culture today, which is fascinating from a historical perspective. And who knew there were, individuals out there that studied contemporary Christian music, but I'm so glad that she did. As you and I mentioned her in the interview, brought back a lot of memories.
A lot of
And
memories.
one of my core memories from youth group in that
Hey,
age.
I have heard your core memories from youth group. I don't think it's appropriate for this podcast.
Hey, true. So let's go to yes, this one's appropriate. Yes. So my core memories from youth group involve a lot of fear. One, satanic panic was huge
Oh, yeah.
back then, 80s, right? About playing music backwards.
Yep.
And we talk a little bit about that in the interview, but apparently, so I've done a deep dive since our talk with Leah because I wanted to learn more about this. Yes. So we're going to talk about this. I didn't know there's a term for this. It's called backmasking.
Okay, yeah.
Right now, I'm surprised several of our listeners are going, yeah, we all knew this. This was new information to me. So there is a technique called backmasking where you can actually intentionally put words into music when it's reversed. So I found this guy on YouTube who talked about the songs. Yes, because YouTube is the oracle for all things true, right?
Yeah, and let me remind the audience that I am not in the office this week.
Right.
So go ahead with your research.
Oh, yes. So apparently, I don't know if you remember sitting in Bible study, I did, and our youth ministers would play records, and then they would play them backwards, and we were supposed to be able to hear the satanic messages in these records, right?
Yeah.
I never could really hear it, right? But you certainly weren't going to admit that. So you said that you heard it, right? Okay.
Sure.
Anywho, so I looked up some of the songs that supposedly had messages, and I thought I would share them with you.
Good. I'm glad you're sharing them and not doing a quiz. So go.
No, because this would be too difficult. Okay, so these are in no particular order, but just a few of the ones that supposedly or intentionally had messages. Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin.
Oh, of course.
Do you know what the message was supposedly?
What was the backmasking?
Here's to my sweet Satan.
Poor Led Zeppelin.
I know. Another one is Another One Bites the Dust by Queen.
Oh, well, yeah. Freddie Mercury, of course.
Actually had several accusations of backmasking, and his supposed backmasking in that song was, quote, "It's fun to smoke marijuana." Which, I mean, in this day and age, I think there are a lot of people who were against that at that time. They'd be like, yeah, okay.
I just think of all the messages that you could portray to millions of listeners around the world. You're going to go with smoking marijuana is fun.
Fun, right? So there's another song I'm not familiar with by Judas Priest called "Stained Class."
Uh-huh.
And I mentioned it because there were lawsuits involved in Arkansas. And supposedly the reverse message on that was "Sing My Evil Spirit."
Oh, that's the bomb. Yeah.
And "Snowblind" by Styx was court case involved, and the supposed message there was Satan moves through our voices. So why I mentioned those two is because apparently this prompted Arkansas to pass a law that said any album that contained backmasking had to be labeled as such.
Wow.
Like the parental advisory warning.
I will stop by the local record store while I'm in town and see if they have those warnings.
Right. So songwriter Dennis DeYoung was quoted as saying, "We have enough trouble making these records sound right forward."
That is a wise man. Oh my gosh, that is so.
It was such a core memory for me in youth group as being cautioned against rock and roll, cautioned against songs, because clearly if you listen backwards, you were going to become a Satanist, which is like this Weird Al Yankovic said, who has time for this?
Yeah. Well, Missy, anybody who has met you knows that you listened to rock and roll as you grew up.
I did. As I mentioned to Leah, I have zero ability to commit. So I went through phases of being like all sold out on contemporary Christian music, but it never lasted very long.
That's right. That's right. Well, yeah, we had the privilege of sitting down with Leah Payne this week, who has a book titled God Gave Rock and Roll to You, A History of Contemporary Christian Music. And it did take me and Missy down memory lane a little bit when we were teenagers going to youth group. So we hope you enjoy our conversation with Leah. We'll be right back. We've got a lot going on at Good Faith Media in 2025. New logo, new website, new initiatives, and if you don't know, our new magazine. Good Faith Magazine includes Bible study and lessons. Our new lesson writers are Kathy and Nathan Maxwell, and they host a free, short, weekly podcast in support of their Bible study lessons. In the Good Faith Bible Study Podcast, and it's free. Learn more about the magazine, the lessons, the Maxwells, the podcast, and more at goodfaithmedia.org. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got a very special guest with us. Leah Payne is an award-winning historian and associate professor of American religious history at Portland Seminary. She holds a Ph.D. from Vanderbilt University, and her research explores the intersection of religion, politics, and popular culture. Payne is author of God Gave Rock and Roll to You, A History of Contemporary Christian Music. She is the co-host of Rock That Doesn't Roll, a podcast about Christian rock and its listeners. She's also the co-host of Spirit and Power, a podcast about politics and Pentecostal and charismatic Christians, and is co-creator of Weird Religion, a religion and pop culture podcast. Her writings and research have appeared in The Washington Post, NBC News, Religion News Service, Harper's Magazine, The Economist, and Christianity Today. Leah, welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
Thank you. I'm so honored to join you today. Thanks for having me.
And congratulations on the book. I mean, we just finished it this week. It was fantastic.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a real honor to have people read it and to connect with the work. So thank you.
I do have to mention, though, I have to mention this, though, Missy, before I turn it over to you. I would have appreciated a little bit of a trigger warning, though, because those of us who grew up in evangelical churches, it was like, oh, I got real twitchy when some of those songs came up.
You know, you're not the first person to mention that, and I'm so sorry. I just have to say, I don't know, my sympathies.
All right, Leah. So first of all, that introduction, do you need a nap? I feel like
She's got a lot going on.
I got coffee. Coffee is my friend.
There you go. So yeah, like Mitch said, I mean, the book it just brought back so many memories. I get a little bit twitchy. Lots of earworms.
Yes, definitely.
As we're looking through the content. But before we get started kind of diving in, for those of us who survived this, kind of 80s, 90s movement and are trying to forget, or maybe those who aren't as familiar, who did not grow up in youth camp and such, give us a brief description of CCM, what that movement is, and also what has inspired you to research kind of what I would consider a pretty niche subject.
Right. Oh, thank you. That's a great question. And I want to ask you, so I'm just going to tell you, I'll ask you at the end of my response, if you had like a favorite artist, because I always like to hear from people, or if there's a song that really stands out to you. So I'll give you time to think about it. Okay. So contemporary Christian music, this is a great question because even people who were raised in evangelical communities in like the aughts aren't always sure what contemporary Christian music is or was. In fact, I gave a presentation at Baylor University when I was kind of beginning the process of doing research. And there were a bunch of undergrads who came to my lecture. I think they were offered extra credit in a class. So they were there
Right.
For that reason. And so I asked, raise your hand if you know what contemporary Christian music is. And none of the 18 to 22-year-olds raised their hand.
Wow.
And I'm very sure that the majority of them were raised in evangelical settings. Now they knew what worship music was, and they knew about, groups like Maverick City and such, but they didn't know about contemporary Christian music. Why? Well, contemporary Christian music, the way I define it in the book is it was a niche, a market niche, an
Hmm.
industry that was created as a form of pop music that was infused with conservative evangelical themes and theological ideas and political ideas, and was meant to function as a parallel form of entertainment to the general market. And so the name of contemporary Christian music, it actually comes from a periodical that was developed on the West Coast. A bunch of hippieized Christians called Jesus People had experienced these really ecstatic revivals, and part of that happened at a church where they started writing about their experiences, and they called it Contemporary Christian acts, and the music section was the by far the most read and most popular. So then they just changed over to contemporary Christian music. So that's where the name comes from. But the business was this thing that thrived in the 70s, 80s, 90s, early aughts, and has declined a lot. But I got interested in writing about it because I was trained as an American religious historian, but my background, I was raised in a West Coast charismatic church, very charismatic church.
Hmm.
And as an American religious historian, I started to reflect on certain aspects of that world. And when I first moved to Nashville, so I did go to Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. But when I first moved there, I worked for a contemporary Christian music producer. Actually, he's a producer whose career extends far beyond CCM, but he's a major figure in that world. His name is Charlie Peacock. And when I worked for Charlie, I was plunged into the world of contemporary Christian music. And when I began to reflect on it as a historian, um, I noticed that CCM would be written about. CCM is the acronym for contemporary Christian music. I noticed that that would be written about as kind of a quirky, fringe, niche world, as you said. Um, but I also knew that it was extremely powerful in people's lives. And so I started the project as a way of saying, well, what if we look at this thing that a lot of people dismiss as kitsch or as kind of silly? And what if I took it as seriously as a historian as the people who were raised with it took it?
Right.
So I wanted to
Right.
give it a really serious scholarly treatment. And I'm thankful that I did, because I've gotten to connect with so many people for whom it was this transformative part of their Christian experience. Was that the case for you? Were you raised with contemporary Christian music?
Yes, to a point. I notoriously suck at committing to anything. So, like,
It's lucky our marriage has made it.
I mean, just sensing a parallel here. Um, but I would go through spurts where I was like, because the youth minister would say you could only listen to Christian radio, and so it would be all Christian radio. And then I'd be like, I'm tired of this. So I'd go back. So I went back and forth in it. I, in some weird sense, envy those people, especially that are just a little bit younger than me, who were all in and know all the artists and all the song and get all the jokes. Like it's almost like trauma envy in a way. That's
Wow. I think you just coined a term.
So
no,
funny.
yeah, no, don't quote me on that. That will not be well received. But I'm close enough to it to understand the implications and some of the results of it, but was never all in um as much as a lot of people were.
Yeah.
So it's definitely a part of my upbringing.
Yeah, and Leah, I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, so which was the hotbed of the charismatic movement for some time. Lived right between Oral Roberts University and Rhema Bible College, so it was filled with not only the music itself, but just the mentality and culture of the music. And
That's like a spiritual like triangle. What do you call the Bermuda Triangle?
that's exactly right. Exactly right. Uh, but what I was going to tell you is that I grew up in Southern Baptist churches, and that's where my family attended. But on Sunday nights, Leah, my friends and I in high school would tromp over to South Tulsa, and we would attend Higher Dimensions Evangelical Center. The
Wow.
pastor at Higher D, as they called it, was Carlton D. Pearson.
That's right.
And his most famous member sat on the front row every
He
Sunday
did
night.
not.
He
He did
did.
not.
And that was Carmen.
Of course I knew who that is. Oh my goodness. Yes, when Carmen died a little while ago, my friend and I, Dr. Dara Delgado, shout out to Dr. Delgado.
Yeah.
She and I wrote a piece about Carmen after his death, and we included a link to Carmen's duet with Carlton Pearson.
Mhm.
I think it's just called Joy or I've Got the Joy, which is one of my favorite Carmen songs. I will admit readily to enjoying listening to that one, probably because of Carlton Pearson
Right.
on it, but that is incredible. You witnessed really a critical part of Pentecostal history.
I did.
I mean, Carmen was a huge superstar, but Carlton Pearson's a really pivotal, important figure as well. So, wow, now did you sneak? Was this like
Oh,
something
no.
that
No, it was the yeah, my parents were fine with it. And what was interesting, in examining the contemporary Christian movement, and you lay it out so beautifully in the book, of the influences upon, or the influence that the charismatic movement, Pentecostalism, had upon CCM, and that certainly was the case with Oral Roberts, Rhema, but then also Carlton Pearson. Now, Carlton certainly had an epiphany, halfway through his ministry, became a Unitarian. But that moment in time, they were all in. And so there was this infusion, or this merger between the charismatic movement. And so we were seeing the ramifications of that in our Southern Baptist culture. So our youth groups, especially, were dabbling in Pentecostal beliefs and practices. And so it wasn't that far-fetched for me to go to an SBC church on Sunday morning and then Higher D on Sunday night.
Well, I love that because that's just a micro example of a macro trend
Mhm.
in evangelicalism. And one of the things that I tried to show in the book is that if you look at the music, the kind of the guiding question of the book was, what do you learn about evangelicalism? Do you learn anything new? If so, what
Mhm.
about evangelicalism if you look at this one industry? And there are many industries that comprise what we might think of as 20th century evangelicalism, but music has a special place because it's part of church liturgy and also part of American pop culture. And CCM was just huge. It
So
is a
big.
massive industry, financially as well as culturally and politically. And what you see is exactly what you experienced, which is through music. And in the book, I write about this. There's another historian named Randall Stevens who has this really detailed history called The Devil's Music that gets into many more details about the origins of rock music. But in the book, I tried to show that Pentecostals and then their practical and theological siblings, younger siblings, the charismatics, they helped create rock and roll
Mhm.
and pop music and many forms of American pop music, particularly Black and white Southern Pentecostals.
Yeah.
And then they helped popularize it, also helped condemn it, and then eventually re-embrace it. And then they through that, and Billy Graham, this is something that Southern Baptist icon Billy Graham understood very well. He understood that if you can get people singing something, because that was his own experience as an adolescent,
Mhm.
then you've got them,
Right.
right? In a way that hearing a sermon or reading a book could just never do.
Yeah.
And so your experiences, I think, um are really telling. I mean, it's one thing to be, raised in Sunday school or catechism
Right.
or whatever. And then it's another thing to just have a great time
Yeah.
singing. And that's so formative, and I I've heard from so many people who oftentimes it was in a church service or it was at a Christian music festival where it was this um just transformative life moment,
Yeah.
many transformative life moments that just reading doesn't get there for
Right.
you.
Yeah. And so we're gonna
So you mentioned,
we're gonna dive into some of those specifics, Missy. I'm sorry, but I do want to back up and talk a little bit about the movement from 30,000 foot, because you mentioned a little bit about the history of it. And that's one of the things I really appreciated about the book, particularly you laying the historic foundation of how CCM came into existence. And you mentioned kind of that rock and roll and, Elvis Presley and, those Southern rockers, Jerry Lee Lewis, all of them kind of came out of that kind of religious background or religious culture. And in the rise of rock and roll, you began to see kind of the influences that rock and roll had upon CCM and vice versa. And so I really appreciated the historical analysis of it. And you do a really nice job of laying that groundwork, beginning actually in the late 19th century, all the way to the Jesus movement, to today's modern contemporary movement. So, as far as CCM is concerned, again, staying at that 30,000 foot level, have you done any comparison on the CCF movement with like music during the Reformation period of time or the Renaissance period? Because I mean, it was such an influential mechanism to deliver a message to culture of how music was used in those periods versus our contemporary setting today.
Absolutely. In fact, I think, there are many examples where music is at the forefront of social and religious political movements. And Martin Luther, of course, famously understood how um, he intuited and probably and also theologized about how
Right.
putting music into a more vulgar or common parlance would help the ideas of the Reformation travel well. And I have to give a shout out to one historian who really helped me, Dr. Daniel Ramirez, who writes about Mexican Pentecostals and their music. He's kind of like one of the original idea makers for me for this book because he writes about how in migrant communities who have very little social or political resources, music is this portable way to get big ideas out in a durable and efficient way. And I think that you see that. I mean, one of my favorite kind of uh, Protestant comparisons
Mhm.
would be the Wesleys and
Yeah,
Methodism.
that's
And
good.
there's no coincidence because many of the holiness movements that helped create the businesses of contemporary Christian music had Methodist roots, and so I think you see it's just a couple hundred years, down the road from them. But I think Methodists understood the power of revival meetings,
Hmm.
and they understood the power of revival music. And in many ways, the what becomes contemporary Christian music is like the next generations of that. So yes, music is just a human thing,
Right.
and really, in many ways, we should ask ourselves why we haven't, in whatever era, why we don't pay more attention to music.
Mhm.
'Cause it's just, I dare anyone to go into, just like a raucous, charismatic meeting,
Right.
and you might hate what's going on, like message-wise or theology, whatever, but it's very hard not to feel moved.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah.
It's so powerful what you were talking about with Billy Graham understanding that the music is the way, and that's absolutely my experience. I mean, so many pivotal moments growing up in church and in youth group were at the youth camp and, doing praise and worship. And of course, at that period, it was very much the youth were against the adults who just sang from the hymnal and had the organ. And we really knew how to worship, right? We had it all figured out. But I want to talk about for a minute about the objectives of CCM. We talk about converting people, especially young people, and then to oppose, secular rock and roll. But what I want you to kind of talk a little bit about that, but talk about just also the effort to reinforce that evangelical message and kind of the implications of that.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, so, um what's fascinating to me is when I started looking at contemporary Christian music, one of the first people who I talked with was someone who'd been my choir director in college, and he was the creator of one of the vocal jazz ensembles that was a precursor to contemporary Christian music,
Mhm.
a group called Regeneration. And then eventually he went on to do a vocal jazz ensemble at Disney World, by the way. And Disney's like an interesting
Yeah, it is.
uh, corporate partner that shows up in many ways in the history of contemporary Christian music. So he was very familiar with this world. And he was like, you need to start with the holiness revivals. Like that's where this group, where all these uh, kind of the businesses got started. And he was right. The first big business of contemporary Christian music was Benson Records, but before that, it was a holiness songbook revival company. And what I found was, if you look at the groups who make up what becomes contemporary Christian music, when we think of like generic evangelicalism, in many ways, like what are we even talking about here? That's like conservative white Protestants. Usually that's what kind of a shorthand for that. But if you look at the music, you see really mostly three groups, three and three to four, and that's they're mostly white Baptists, so predominantly Southern Baptist, but you get the
Sure.
independent Baptists in there too, and there's a million different Baptists, as
Oh,
we
yeah.
all know. Um, and you get holiness people, so Wesleyans, Nazarenes, those types of groups, and then you get Pentecostals and eventually charismatics, which I think of as an extension, in many ways, of the Pentecostal movement. And so it's the messages and the dearest hopes for their children of those three groups. And I think that that explains a lot of why, I heard a lot of anecdotal evidence of people who would say, I was raised Presbyterian, and then I went to a church camp and fell in love with contemporary Christian music. And then my parents thought I joined a cult, like they
Yeah.
were all weirded out because they were like, why are you acting this way? Or
Right.
someone told me she had a Methodist mother and a Catholic father, and she went to a Texas Baptist youth camp, came back all excited about CCM and wanted to know from her mom if her dad was going to hell because she had been, taught that
Oh, yeah.
at Baptist camp. And so it's what I think what is fascinating to me is it is a form of evangelical activism that shows you how three groups became really powerful through their music. And so you're not hearing like a generic form of evangelicalism. You're really hearing these three groups in conversation with one another, and you're seeing how they're trading ideas back and forth. In the earliest days, it would be teetotaling, right? They don't want their young people to drink alcohol. And so they really have this monumental political accomplishment with prohibition. Of course, we all know that didn't work super well, but long term. But it was an amazing political like accomplishment, right?
Mhm.
And it just keeps going. So if you listen to the music, you hear um the visions that these communities had for their young people.
Mhm.
And some of it's kind of surprising. I enjoyed that part a lot.
So, Leah, one of the things that really surprised me, and I don't know if you did this intentionally or unintentionally, was when you walked us through kind of the evolution of CCM, especially beginning, early stages of the 70s and then, hitting kind of its height in the 80s and 90s, that it was really built upon a business model of marketing to a certain demographic. But even in the weeds that you portrayed in the story, that again, I don't know if this was intentional or unintentional, but it seems like a lot of the focus was on a teenage girl in the 1980s who was going to youth group
Hmm.
and the emphasis of on purity culture and remaining pure and all of that. And even the overall message was actually geared towards that young teenage girl. But then as the 90s unfolded, they kind of started to change their marketing to a younger adult and then eventually what we would term a minivan mom. That that was kind of the target for the overall movement to hit to create content for that particular person setting in the 80s and 90s and aughts. Did you see that or is I'm just reading into something there?
Well, first off, I have to say, I have to give so much credit to the people who I interviewed for the book who were involved in evangelical media making in some kind of way.
Hmm.
So whether or not they were part of the Christian Booksellers Association or if they were a part of, I talked to people who like were in charge of distribution for Lifeway, which was one of the major
Okay.
distributors of very Christian music, or they managed a Christian bookstore, or they did marketing for Christian bookstores. And just in case your listeners aren't aware, one of the quirks of contemporary Christian music that set it apart from mainstream music is that the vast majority of it was sold through not through music stores like in the olden days, Tower or Warehouse, but through Christian
Yeah.
bookstores. And because of that, they music was sold to the core customer of the Christian bookstore. And from the 1970s on, the core customer of the Christian bookstore was an evangelical mom. And that's what made contemporary Christian music really fascinating is that these marketers and salespeople, the people who I talked with, were just absolutely brilliant people
Right.
who were really excellent kind of lay sociologists, culture critics, and they understood the assignment. They were selling to moms.
Yeah.
So from the 1970s on, the marketing schemes reflect that concentration. Now, whether or not these moms were always accurately depicted is a good question,
Hmm.
right? So,
Yeah.
but so in the 1970s and 80s, you can see what moms are worried about. Well, in many cases, they're worried about this thing that we kind of joke about now, but the satanic panic, right? They worry about all the
Yes.
metal like AC/DC and
Again, I refer you back to Carmen. I was all in on the Satanic Panic.
oh my goodness, yeah, Carmen was like one big huge answer to that, but also Stryper, like
Mhm.
Petra, bands that were meant to counter the really trendy thing in mainstream rock, which was to like Motley Crue and stuff, which was to include symbols of the occult
Right.
in their music, and whether or not they were actually Satanists is actually kind of a funny question.
I heard that
Uh,
albums played backwards, Leah. They are Satanist.
Backmasking, right? Everything like and there's this whole interesting class of parenting experts that are self-taught, usually a lot of times they're male evangelical men who
Right.
toured the country as experts, teaching parents like you shouldn't be listening to this music and here's why. And anyway, it's kind of like that focus on the family plugged in for films, but for music. Anyway, so in the 80s, you see that. In the 90s, with the rise of responses to both the AIDS crisis and also Clinton era policy about sex ed in public schools, you see a turn toward sex education. And that's what I think you were
Yeah.
picking up on purity culture. And of course, I tried to portray, and I'm certainly not the first person, shout out to someone like Sarah Mosliner, who has traced the history of
Mm.
the purity movement and its disproportionate focus on young women
Right.
versus young men. But, you have the purity movement in the 90s and the early aughts, you get a lot of responses to, you have to think about like what were evangelical moms thinking about or supposedly thinking about in the early aughts. And I mean, certainly everyone was thinking about after 9/11 about, the war,
Hmm.
but also they were thinking about things like responding to school shootings, and there's like a
Right.
huge kind of cottage industry of music that is, I write about how Columbine actually inspired a bunch of contemporary Christian music. So what I tried to show is that in every era, the industry, and this is what I want to, I tried to be really careful to say Christian people were making music of all kinds, of all political, aims and varieties, but the focus was on white suburban moms, and in the early aughts, digital marketers got really good, and they created a persona, a marketing persona for her, and her name was Becky, which I laughed so hard when I was what her name was. So it's Becky's, right? So in the early aughts, they had these Becky's, and so to the great frustration of artists whose work sat outside of what people imagined suburban white moms would want for, suburban evangelical white moms would want for their children. Other types of music, other styles, other like music from other ethnic communities did not make it into contemporary Christian music, into the kind of the bulk of their sales
Mhm.
because they were so laser focused on Becky's
Right.
and what they wanted. And that to me is fascinating because it's a story about parental aspirations as much as it is anything. Like who are these moms and what do they want for their kids? And you see that played out in the music.
With such
Oh,
an emphasis on the purity culture, and just this incredible high, and I hate to use this term, standard of living your life that the artist from CCM were expected to live and the audience was expected to follow, it really set itself up for a lot of great tragedies. And we hear that in the story of CCM, and you portray it very well in the book. How did that play out? I mean, we had some significant artists who went through divorce, some dealing with their sexuality, coming out, and then being shunned by the industry. Um, did any of that surprise you? What can you tell us more about a lot of those moments where the icons of this industry began to, and again, don't, I hate this terminology, but began to fall from grace?
Yeah. Well, I think here's where understanding contemporary Christian music as being really influenced by the holiness movement
Yeah.
is really helpful. Because if you're not familiar with the holiness movement in the late 19th and early 20th century, these forms of revivalist Christians came to believe that the Holy Spirit could move in power and that if you were someone who adopted pretty strict ascetic codes, like you don't drink, you don't
Mhm.
smoke, you don't socially dance, you can dance under the power of the Holy Spirit, maybe, but you don't dance, eventually you don't go to movies,
Right.
you don't gamble, you don't participate in quote unquote worldly activities, that you'll be empowered by the Holy Spirit to do these kind of wonder working things. Pentecostals take it an extra step and add tongues and healing and all that kind of stuff in there. But so if you think about a lot of the music is shaped by those people in those communities. Famous examples, Sandy Patty, for
Mhm.
example, she'd be a huge one. Now, when somebody like Sandy Patty, who's raised in the holiness movement, gets divorced, and it comes out later that she had had an extramarital affair, um, it's not like a a garden variety Presbyterian,
Right.
or this is major. This is like a
Major news.
theological, practical crisis. And so I think for the people who participated in it, I mean, Sandy Petty's been very open about how painful that was, how difficult it was, how punishing the market was, because there's just essentially there are a series of bans or boycotts that happen oftentimes. I know in the book that men are often able to get divorced privately,
Mhm.
and it doesn't become as big of a story in contemporary Christian music as it does for women. For members of the LGBTQ plus community, it's extraordinarily painful, and if things ended up like out in public, oftentimes the response was um, very cruel and punishing towards those people. And I know several folks. I think one thing that's helpful to keep in mind is that for a lot of people, it's a part of the business model. So
Yeah.
the what sells is a public version of holiness, and it's a very specific articulation of it. And and so the book or the music distributors could often be, I'm sure to many of the artists it felt quite ruthless,
Mhm.
because they were worried about their bottom line,
Mhm.
and so it was important to be seen as publicly disciplining these people, and that's something that just it makes sense if you're in the world. It's sort of hard to explain a lot of times to people outside the industry. But I think what you have to understand is that the theological and practical ideas were interwoven with the business model. And so it was a almost like a ritual, you had to publicly, if it came out in public. I write about how there's lots of stories that never saw the light of day. And I heard many people told me lots of stories that I wasn't interested in outing anyone in any kind of
Right.
way. So I stuck to stories that were in public
Sure.
record. Fortunately, there's plenty of those too. So I didn't
Right.
it's like I left anything out.
Yeah.
But there was a public business face, and then oftentimes private agony. I will say though that there are plenty of figures in contemporary Christian music whose who had continuity in their public and private
Right.
lives.
Yeah.
They're as wholesome as they might seem, like as they're marketed to. But I think for the many folks who, I mean, because these are really strict ideals for living.
Right.
Um, and if they don't conform to those, it is very rough.
Yeah.
And there are a variety of ways that people responded to it.
Yeah, we're very fortunate because
So,
we're in our next issue of Good Faith Magazine. Our featured story is on Jennifer Knapp. So Jennifer's been working with
oh,
our writers, and we're really excited to tell her story in our magazine.
I'm delighted
So
by
Leah,
my favorite interviews. Go ahead.
oh, nice. Okay, so we've talked a lot about kind of the 70s, 80s, 90s thoughts. Let's talk about this just before we wrap things up, the movement today.
Hmm.
Is
Sure.
it still relevant? Is it still affecting culture? And if so, how?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you so much. I would say that the business of contemporary Christian music, so all of the church organizations and parachurch organizations and institutions that upheld contemporary Christian music. So, whether it is traditional denominations like the Southern Baptist Convention or organizations like the True Love Waits organization or organizations like, the Christian Booksellers Association or Christian music festivals, all of those are in precipitous decline. Every single one of the ones that I just mentioned are not as large or as prosperous as they were when the industry was in its height. And um, so the business of contemporary Christian music as a parallel form of entertainment and edification and catechesis for young people, that model is not as prominent as it was when the move or when the business was at its height. And there are a lot of reasons for that I cover in the book, but one big obvious one is the internet, right? So if you're going to create a bubble of entertainment for evangelical children to live in, you can't police that anymore once the internet is a part of everyday people's lives and streaming technology and all that kind of stuff. But that's not to say that the same communities aren't still shaping cultural conversations within and outside of evangelicalism. And one of the surprising parts that I found while writing this book was that if you look at the music, you see how the group that was once a fringe member that counted itself as lucky to be involved in organizations like the National Association of Evangelicals, Pentecostals, they went from being the fringe group to being the core of music in evangelical circles, charismatics and Pentecostals. If you go to a garden variety, quote unquote, evangelical church, particularly a mega church, I would guess 70 to 99% of the music that you sing comes from charismatic or Pentecostal um, communities, regardless of what the denomination of that worshiping body is. So they ascended through worship music, which I look at as sometimes overlapping, but ultimately distinct business. So the aim of worship music is not to provide adolescents with counter programming to mainstream culture. The aim of the worship is business is ostensibly to create music for liturgy. It often is fulfilling the same function because a lot of people consume worship music in the car, just like they did contemporary Christian music. But that's kind of the aim. So, but the aim to shape the lives of adolescents through mass media continues. And that, there are lots of people I cover in the book that are still using technology and mass media and music to impart conservative messaging on adolescents. It's just they don't have the same institutional supports that contemporary Christian music had. And they have much tougher competition if you think about it, because it's it's a lot harder to police the media um, consumption of teens now than it was 30 years ago.
Hmm.
I know that gives like parents outside and inside evangelical communities headaches. I mean, I'm a mom, I have kids. I live in fear of the day that my children are old enough to have their own social media accounts, because it's a disturbing world out there,
Right.
so but the work continues. The
Sure.
work continues.
Okay. So, Leah, the last question I have before I turn it over to Missy for our final question is this. Another theme within the book is the relationship between CCM and right wing politics, especially.
Right.
How significant has CCM been in the rise of this modern day right wing political movement, in particular, the rise of Donald Trump and the MAGA movement? Because some of these artists you know, are advocating for right wing politics. So, talk a little bit about that.
Sure. One of the things that I trace in the book is that from the get go, these revivalist communities that created the businesses that became CCM were aware that music was a very powerful tool to use in political advocacy, whether or
Mhm.
not it's temperance or if it's anti-communist activism in the during the Cold War. Eventually, it becomes purity culture, any big important issue that conservative white evangelical folks believed were facing their children. You can find a song for that, a
Yeah.
contemporary Christian music song for that. A lot of it in the Cold War was stoking patriotism. So right when Ronald Reagan was out there talking about American exceptionalism, there was a song, many songs for that. So what I think the music shows is how charismatics have ascended in evangelical communities and have come to drive evangelical activism. And so you see that in the music. And um one of the things that I think is really important about as we observe the rise of MAGA
Hmm.
Trumpian politics, I don't know what you
Yeah.
for people 20, 30 years from now, probably to label, but if we look at that, if you look at the charismatics, you can see that coming, right? So you see a populist, a group of Christians who are not particularly tied to or beholden to, or they don't even necessarily see the value in institutions, for one thing.
Hmm.
So I think when people saw Trump, they saw someone who was talking about breaking down institutions. And if you have a Billy Graham Baptist in your mind, you would just be like so surprised. How would somebody who, an upstanding member of the Southern Baptist Convention be attracted to someone like Donald Trump? And of course, we've seen how that can be, but they might not be. But the charismatics are not bothered by someone who wants to smash institutions, right? They don't
Right.
even need institutions anyway. They've got their own networks. They're excited about someone who functions like a king, right? One of the things that I try to teach my seminary students is that Baptists are historically, in many varieties, very concerned with democracy as a theological project
Hmm.
and as a form of like God working through the life of an individual believer, voting as that. And you see that in conservative and liberal Baptist circles, black, white, that's democracy is very important for Baptists. Charismatics, not so much.
Hmm.
So if you see somebody like Trump, I think you see support in conservative circles, particularly among charismatics, in part because it's a different form of evangelicalism.
Right.
They love celebrity culture historically speaking.
Yeah.
I've written about this a lot. Charismatics have a very they're not what's the I'm trying to think of a way to say this. They have a high tolerance for scandal.
Okay. Yeah.
Particularly And so like they're not going to be super bothered,
Yeah.
long term with scandal. And so Trump actually makes a lot of sense in that context.
Right.
And so yeah, I think
That's fascinating.
is the harbinger, like and charismatics have ushered in a new form of conservative activism. We've seen it all over the place, right? And I think it's fascinating to watch legacy media folks, people who understand religious communities like yourselves, I think get it a little faster
Right.
than in mainstream, like the kind of quote unquote legacy media outlets, because they still have Billy Graham in their minds.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, no, 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 this is a whole other group.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, Leah Payne, we appreciate you coming on this week to Good Faith Weekly. Leah's book is titled God Gave Rock and Roll to You, A History of Contemporary Christian Music. It has been a delight. You are welcome back anytime to Good Faith Weekly. But before we let you go, Leah, Missy's got one last question for you that she asked all of our guests.
So, Leah, as you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So, in light of your work and our conversation today, what is your more to tell?
Oh, thank you so much. Okay, well, I would like to tell you all about I host a summer institute at Candler
Oh,
School
great.
of Theology in Atlanta, Georgia, the Summer Institute for Global Charismatic and Pentecostal Studies. And this summer, it's in May. So if you think of that as summer, it's close enough. This May, we will be talking about music and the ascent of global charismatic and Pentecostal Christian communities. And it's May 21st through 23rd at Candler School of Theology at Emory University. And it is free and open to the public. So I'd love for anybody who's in the area to come join us.
Great. And where can they find more information about it?
You can find that on Candler's website, candler.emory.edu, and I can provide you with a link if
Great.
you'd be
Yep.
willing to in the show notes. That'd be
Yep.
awesome.
We'll put it in the show notes. So, well, Leah, thank you so much. We really appreciate our conversation today. Again, the book is terrific. Thank you so much for providing it to us. And thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you for being such gracious hosts.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. Missy and I just finished up our conversation with Professor Leah Payne, whose new book, God Gave Rock and Roll to You, A History of Contemporary Christian Music, is out wherever you get your reading materials. Well, Missy, I told Professor Payne this during the interview. I'm going to state it again. Her book should have come with a trigger warning.
Right. I did feel very twitchy. And also, like I told her, the earworms. Oh my gosh, the earworms. El Shaddai.
Oh my gosh, right?
Friends are friends forever. I mean, all of this is like playing on repeat now in my head, but it did drive home the point that she made in the book and that she, touched on a little bit in the interview, just the power of music
Oh my gosh.
to influence and to impact and to get in your head and really adapt your way of thinking. And like I said in the interview, I know this is kind of a niche subject,
Mhm.
but yet it's so important that we all understand how this impacts the culture that we live in today.
Yeah, and it has throughout centuries here in America. It's done it since our beginning, but at the same time, it's become so prevalent in the last century or so. And in Professor Payne's book, she talks about the rise of rock and roll and how it kind of came out of that Southern hillbilly genre of music. And she mentions people like Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis. Sorry about that. And about those same sounds could be heard uh, in communities, and then they brought them into rock and roll. But they were also sounds of the community, and the music and the beats and the lyrics really kind of came out of that rural Pentecostal type of religion, and it was really fascinating to read. But she just talks about the power of music and how much influence rock and roll was having on the youth of the day, and then also their parents back in the 50s and then the 60s. I mentioned Woodstock at the beginning of this. You think about the late 60s, and it was just so inundated with cultural music. Really, really fascinating. And Christians realized that and they capitalized on
Well, I mean, when there's money to be made, Mitch, there's money.
it.
I think that's the lesson at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And I was an adult, I mean, an embarrassing age that I won't admit, when somebody first like mentioned the idea to me of hymn theology even. So
Mhm.
predating like, our youth group, Contemporary
Right.
Christian Music, about how much of our theology is based on hymns, not on scripture, what was preached, but hymns. And I my mind was blown. I was like, "Oh my God, you're right." What we believe is because of what we've been singing.
Right.
And so that's why work, like Leah's and others is really it's at first glance somebody might scoff, but it's so important because it does impact culture, it impacts our way of thinking, it impacts our ethic, our politic, everything.
Yeah.
And in the Oscars when they do the awards for music overlay and editing and all that, and the last few years I've noticed they've done a bit where they take the music out of a movie
Hmm.
and just show you what it would be like.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really a different experience. I mean, it's almost not an experience.
It's a different experience. So yeah, I think we recognize how music impacts us, but I think in this genre
Hmm.
it's especially important to look at that and to really examine how that has impacted our lives and our culture.
Yeah, and music. Here's always been my beef with CCM, Missy, and you know what this beef is that the music is horrible.
To out you. I'm
It's
okay.
terrible. It's terrible,
But
terrible music. And so,
I feel like that's acceptable to say now, but even when it was not acceptable,
oh
when I
my God.
first almost 30 years ago, you were like, yeah, this music is terrible.
I did. I've always thought it, always still think it. But I think what you said earlier is so right that, Christians, especially those first who kind of created CCM and the movement associated with it, realized the power of music. And my problem, as I said, is not necessarily Christian music. It is the kind of Christian music and the kind of Christian message that goes along with that bad music. Because I think that there could really be something significant done in the realm of, and I don't want to use this term, Christian music, but I think there there could be some social justice type of writing and composing as we saw in different eras, such as the 60s with folk music. And we saw in the blues and jazz and all kinds of other genres of music. Country music told stories of the Deep South. Probably the best example of it today in mainstream music is Jason Isbell, who is a great storyteller, but in his storytelling, and a great musician and vocalist, but he also is able to weave in that Southern story and that need for justice in that Southern story. So if we could find some new writers and composers, I think we might have hope for the Christian music industry.
We're not saying all writers were bad. We're really not. You need to
Oh,
issue the disclaimer. But as a
no, there are
whole,
some really great artists and great songs. There's no doubt about that.
right. So yeah, no, it
What
was
was making it on K-Love was not that great.
well true. In my part of the world, it was KLTY. See,
Oh, KLTY.
it was all Witch's Invitation and Our God is an Awesome God and all of those things that were
Yeah.
pretty like a little bit hollow. But yes, I agree. I mean, Leah's fascinating. I loved the book. I've enjoyed listening to her podcast as well. So it's been a real fun kind of trek down memory lane and realizing how those messages have impacted me over my lifetime.
Absolutely. All right, Missy, before we sign off for the final time, what might be the final time before next Monday, I do have a question for you. So I
Yes.
want to go back and be introduced to that 15-year-old Missy in youth group.
Yeah, you and I would not have like been in the
Yeah,
same
we
circle.
would have. I was 5 years older than you.
Okay.
I still am.
Yes.
But so what song could we see 15-year-old Missy raising her hand to in youth group and singing with her eyes closed and her heart open?
Let me tell you something. By 15, I had decided boys were way more interesting than contemporary Christian music.
I'm just so glad you said boys were more interested in God. I thought that's where you were going.
I mean, at that age, it's one and the same, right? No, I mean, I had really decided that boys were more interesting. So that would have been my non-contemporary Christian music era.
Yeah.
But prior to that, I mean, yeah, Carmen, which is Invitation, was big. Oh,
Yeah.
Michael W. Smith,
I was
Friends
just
are
like, come on, Missy, did you ever link arms with one another?
Well,
Being friends or friends forever?
Absolutely. Friends are friends forever. If the Lord's the Lord of them. And friends will never say never because the welcome does not end. Like we can
Wow.
go on and on all day. Yes. So what about you? What song would you have been raising your hands to at age 15?
Okay, so here's the secret of this entire episode is that I didn't I didn't have a lot of contemporary Christian music when I was a teenager. It wasn't until I was at college and then got into youth ministry before seminary where it just exploded on me. So yeah, Rich Mullins, Awesome God, Michael W. Smith, Rebecca St. James, Vasquez, Carmen, all of them were just really influential for me. But yeah, lots of memories with music and thinking about that really brought back some good memories and maybe not so good memories. So,
Absolutely. No, I thoroughly enjoyed the book. Like I said, our conversation and her podcast. So yeah, check out Leah Payne and we'll put all of her information in the show notes and definitely you'll want to follow up.
absolutely. So stay tuned. Missy and I will be, well, we might be back next week. We'll have to wait and see. But if we are, we'll be back.
I might allow you back in the same state as me. I hear you're on a second round of steroids now, right?
I am on a second round of steroids. So if I cough between Little Rock and Oklahoma City, I will just stop and find a place to stay.
Divert somewhere else. Absolutely.
All right. So until next week, keep living good faith. You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5.
And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.